January 17, 1987, Chicago, Illinois. Chicago Stadium, 1800 West Madison Street. The temperature outside is 9 degrees Fahrenheit, and the city has been buried under lake-effect snow since the night before. By 5 in the afternoon, the streets around the stadium are impassable to anyone without necessity or obsession, which means the people making their way through the drifts toward the turnstiles are the kind of fans who need basketball the way other people need weather forecasts, as information about what kind of day they are about to have. Inside the building, the floor is already warm. The building holds 18,676 people, and on this January Saturday, the number in attendance will not be far short of that. They have come for a game between the Chicago Bulls and the Philadelphia 76ers, two teams in the middle of the Eastern Conference standings, neither one a championship contender in the conventional sense of the word. They are not here for the standings. They are here because the man wearing number 23 for the home team is doing something in the 1986-87 season that no basketball player had done since Wilt Chamberlain, which is averaging 37.1 points per game and threatening to become only the second player in the history of the sport to score 3,000 points in a single season. They are here because watching Michael Jordan on a basketball floor has become something the residents of this city treat as civic obligation rather than entertainment, an attendance that confirms you understand what you are living through. The Philadelphia 76ers arrive at the stadium in the afternoon, and with them comes Charles Barkley, 23 years old, 6 feet 6 inches tall, and 252 pounds by official measurement, though the official measurement had been a point of gentle dispute since he arrived in the league. The Hall of Fame would later note, with the precision of an institution comfortable with its own authority, that Barkley was in truth closer to 6 feet 4 inches, and that the 2-inch discrepancy made him, functionally, the shortest player in the history of professional basketball to lead the league in rebounding, which he was doing in the 1986-87 season at 14.6 boards per game, including 5.7 on the offensive glass, a number that required positioning and anticipation and contact seeking rather than height, the application of physics through willpower rather than wingspan. Barkley had come to Philadelphia 2 years after Jordan, drafted 5th overall in 1984, 2 picks after Jordan at 3rd, and he had arrived into a team that still contained Julius Erving and Moses Malone, the infrastructure of a championship franchise that had won the title in 1983 and was slowly dismantling around him as the stars of that era aged toward retirement. Malone had been traded to Washington before the start of the 1986-87 season, and Erving was playing in the last year of his career, aware of the clock in the way that great athletes become aware of it when the clock can no longer be ignored. Barkley had become, by necessity and by the natural force of his ability, the team's primary player, the one around whom everything else was arranged, leading the Sixers in scoring at 23 points per game and in rebounding by a margin that made the statistic his property in the way that certain statistics belong to certain players and resist redistribution. He was already, in January of 1987, one of the most recognizable athletes in American sports, not merely because of what he did on a basketball court, but because of the specific way he did it. The way Barkley played basketball was a refusal. It was a refusal to accept that the physics assigned to a body his size should govern what that body was able to accomplish on a basketball floor, a daily demonstration that the conventional wisdom about the relationship between size and outcome could be overridden by a sufficiently determined application of force and will. He had been told in college that he was too small to play power forward in the NBA. He had gone into the weight room and built himself larger. He had been told that a forward his height could not lead the league in rebounding against men 4 and 5 and 6 inches taller. He had taught himself to position and angle and anticipate and contact seek in ways that made his listed measurements irrelevant to the specific collisions he was engineering on each play. The round mound of rebound, people called him, a nickname that was equal parts affection and condescension, the kind of nickname you give a player when you want to acknowledge what he does, while implying that what he does is somehow accidental or improbable. Barkley wore it the way he wore everything directed at him, as an energy source, as information about what other people expected that he could use as a baseline to demonstrate what was actually possible. He had come into the league with Moses Malone, the greatest rebounder of his generation, as his mentor, and Malone had told him directly that his weight was preventing his talent from fully expressing itself, and Barkley had gone and done something about the weight, had disciplined the very body whose indiscipline was being cited as his limitation, had converted the critique into action in the way that only players who are going to be very good can convert critiques into action. The version of Barkley that arrived at Chicago Stadium on January 17, 1987, was the version that had earned everything that was coming. Not the finished version, that would come later, with Phoenix, with the MVP, with the finals appearance, with the career that would eventually accumulate 20,000 points and 10,000 rebounds and 4,000 assists and produce the fourth player in NBA history to reach all three thresholds. But the version that was becoming that. The 23-year-old leading the league in rebounding and averaging 23 points a game, and doing it as the primary player on a team from which Moses Malone and Julius Erving had both recently departed, carrying a franchise on a body that official measurements consistently undersold. He was, in the most honest assessment available, exactly the kind of player that the statement he made in the pregame corridor reflected. A man who believed that physical will, expressed at sufficient intensity, could override most other variables in most competitive situations. It was not an unreasonable belief. It had been the operating principle of his entire career to that point, and the evidence had supported it. The question, on January 17th, was whether it applied to Michael Jordan specifically. It was a fair question. Jordan was not most competitive situations. The way Barkley played basketball was a refusal, and it made every game he played feel like a public performance in a way that games involving more polished, more carefully managed players did not. Barkley said things. He said them before games and during games and after games and on television and in newspapers and in hallways and locker rooms and restaurants, and what he said was rarely diplomatic and frequently true, and the combination of those two qualities made him either exhausting or electrifying depending on who was listening. He was a self-described man without filters in a league that had spent decades constructing filters around its players, and the absence of filtration in his public presentation had made him alternately celebrated and criticized for it in roughly equal measure. In the pregame corridor on January 17th, before the warm-ups had begun, and before the building had filled with the particular frequency of noise that Chicago Stadium produced, Barkley made a statement to the assembled press that would be reported in the Chicago Tribune and reprinted in sports sections across the country in the days that followed. The exact words, as preserved by the Tribune's account, "I won't let Michael Jordan score 40 points if I have to break him up into little pieces." The statement had the quality of all Barkley's public declarations, which was that it was simultaneously braggadocious and technically imprecise in a way that made it more interesting than a more carefully worded version would have been. Barkley was not Jordan's primary defender. A power forward does not routinely guard a shooting guard. The statement was not a tactical assessment. It was a statement of will, of physical intention, of the belief that a man shaped like Charles Barkley and moving with the force Charles Barkley moved with could, if sufficiently motivated, impose his body on another body and change what that body was able to do. Jordan was informed of the statement, as Jordan was always informed of statements made about him, by the infrastructure of competitive awareness he had built around himself since the moment he understood what the stakes of this sport were at the professional level. He was 23 years old, and in the third season of a career that had already produced one of the most remarkable individual statistical runs the sport had seen. A career conducted under the continuous scrutiny of observers who were either cataloging his greatness or questioning whether greatness of the individual kind could ever be sufficient to do what championships actually required, which was collective excellence applied with sustained intelligence over the course of a full season and a playoff run. Jordan had heard the question and absorbed it and done with it what he did with every external input he cataloged as adversarial, which was file it. He had been filing things since he arrived. He filed the draft analysts who projected him as too small to dominate the league, the way he would need to dominate it to justify the third overall pick. He filed the two teams that had passed on him at first and second, Houston taking Hakeem Olajuwon, which no one questioned, and Portland taking Sam Bowie, which would be questioned for the rest of the century. He filed the franchise player who had preceded him in Chicago, a man who had scored 25,000 points but never found a team capable of converting his excellence into championships. He filed the losses to the Celtics, the systematic dismantling he had experienced at the hands of Larry Bird's team in the 1986 playoffs, when Jordan had scored 63 points in a single game, and Bird had described it as God disguised as Michael Jordan, and the Celtics had still swept the series in 3 games, because 63 points from one man is not sufficient when the men around him cannot produce what is necessary to win. He filed all of it in the place where his competitive metabolism processed external information and converted it into something he could use, which was fuel. The Chicago Tribune quote from Barkley went into that place when Jordan read it. He showed nothing on the outside. His preparation for the game did not change. He went through his warm-up in the sequence he always went through it. The layups and the pull-ups and the free throws and the lateral movements. The ritual assembly of readiness that he had built over 3 professional seasons into something that looked less like preparation and more like calibration. The process of bringing a precision instrument to the operating temperature its tasks required. Barkley warmed up at the other end of the floor and watched Jordan from the corner of his vision with the tactical attention of a player who understood that information gathered during warm-ups, properly processed, could adjust the game plan before the opening tip. What he saw was a man moving with complete self-possession, unhurried, making every shot in his warm-up sequence without apparent effort, the ease of mastery rather than the ease of casual preparation. Barkley had played against Jordan in the previous 2 seasons and had developed the specific assessment of him that a competitor develops of a rival they encounter with sufficient regularity to have a data set, which was that Jordan was the most dangerous offensive player he had faced, capable of scoring from any position on the floor against any defensive configuration, and that the specific danger he posed was not in any single move or pattern, but in his ability to read and respond to defensive adjustments faster than those adjustments could be implemented. The game tipped at 7:30 in the evening, and Jordan scored 11 points in the first quarter. Not by accident, and not by the typical cadence of a scorer getting into his rhythm gradually. 11 points in the first 12 minutes, delivered in the mode that the people in the building had come to recognize as Jordan in mid-range operation. Pull-up jumpers from positions the defense had offered him, drives that converted contact into free throws. The full deployment of an offensive vocabulary that had been constructed shot by shot since childhood and was now being delivered against the Philadelphia 76ers in a form that the Sixers had prepared for and could not stop. Barkley scored 9 points in the first quarter, efficient and physical in the way he was always efficient and physical, using the post position he established through sheer mass to generate close-range attempts at a percentage that no player his listed size should have been able to sustain. The Sixers were competitive in the first quarter and competitive into the second, and the crowd, which had come prepared to witness something singular, was providing the specific kind of noise that Chicago Stadium produced when it was watching a game that was still genuinely in question, loud and continuous, but not yet transformed into the different frequency it produced when the outcome became clear. In the third quarter, the game changed in the way basketball games change, which is less like a gradual shift and more like a reorientation of the available gravity. Jordan, who had been operating with the controlled efficiency of a player managing his effort across 48 minutes, shifted registers. This is a thing that happens rarely, and that observers who have seen it enough times develop the ability to recognize from the first possession of the sequence, before the numbers confirm it, before the scoreboard reflects it, the recognition of a quality of attention in the player that is different from the quality of attention they have been bringing to the preceding minutes, a focus that narrows like a lens rather than a searchlight. The compression of everything available into the single problem of the possession in progress. The building recognized it when it happened. The sound changed not in volume, but in texture. The way crowd noise in Chicago Stadium changed when what was happening on the floor crossed the threshold between a good game and something more specific. The people in the upper deck and the people in the press row and the people who had fought through 9-degree weather and lake-effect snow to be in this building were watching something they understood, in real time, was going to be recounted, and they were leaning forward in their seats with the particular physical attitude of witnesses who understand their role. Barkley had said he would break Jordan into little pieces. Jordan, on a drive into the lane in the third quarter, drove directly into Barkley's chest. Not an accident, not a misread of the floor, a deliberate collision with the largest obstacle on the defensive side, as if the statement made before the game had been a coordinate Jordan had input into his navigation system and was now arriving at. They collided in a way that involved full body weight, 225 pounds of Jordan in full acceleration, meeting 252 pounds of Barkley braced to receive it, and the official called an offensive foul on Jordan, ruling that he had used his left hand to guide himself around the forward in a way the rules did not permit. The call meant nothing in the context of what was happening. Jordan absorbed it and ran back up the floor. A couple of minutes later, with Barkley in front of him and in the defensive stance he had dropped into, weight back, hands up, feet set in the textbook form of a defender who was executing what he had been taught and relying on the size advantage his position should have given him. Jordan rose up and hit the fadeaway jumper. Barkley, in front of him, fully committed to the contest and bringing everything his body could offer to the problem of stopping this shot from this shooter in this moment, watched it go in. The fadeaway is specifically designed for this moment. It is a shot that uses the defender's presence as part of the geometry, rather than as an obstacle to it. A shot that goes up and away from the body at the same time, creating a trajectory that the defender's height and wingspan cannot follow because it is moving in the wrong direction for those physical attributes to intercept it. Jordan had been practicing the fadeaway for years because he understood that certain defensive configurations could be defeated only by shots that use the defense itself as a launching condition. Against Barkley, the fadeaway was not a fallback. It was a choice. Jordan did not look at Barkley after the shot went in. He turned and ran back down the floor with the expression of a man completing a task on a list that contained further tasks. The fourth quarter arrived with the Bulls in command, and with the crowd having shifted into the different frequency. The game was no longer in genuine question, and what was happening instead was something the people in Chicago Stadium were watching as a documentation of what the third scoring title in succession was built from. The nightly construction of a season that was assembling itself into historical record in real time. With the Bulls ahead by a margin that allowed him the latitude to try things that a tied game would not permit, Jordan drove the baseline in the fourth quarter and arrived at the rim above Charles Barkley and completed a dunk over him, the 252-pound power forward who had announced before the game that he was willing to disassemble Michael Jordan into component parts if that was what the task required. And Jordan dunked on him with the clean authority of a player who does not experience this kind of situation as drama because he has long since processed it as simply another possession in a game full of possessions. The final score was 105-89. Jordan finished with 47 points, 10 rebounds, and 6 assists. He shot the ball with the efficiency of a man who understood where his shots were coming from before he caught the pass, whose preparation for each attempt began several possessions earlier in the reading of the defense and the construction of the angle, rather than in the moment the ball arrived in his hands. 47 points against a team that had said 40 would not be permitted. 10 rebounds from a player who had come into the game, averaging fewer than half that number, the rebounds that happen when a scorer is moving through the paint repeatedly, and the physics of missed shots favor the player closest to the basket, which was Jordan for large portions of the second half. 6 assists from a player who was not supposed to be the architect of a team's offense, but who had become one anyway, because the triangle hadn't been installed yet, and what Jordan was learning in these years about how a basketball team could be run was going in through observation and repetition and the filing of information. Barkley was asked about it after the game. He had been asked about it, essentially, since before the game had started, since the words he had said in the corridor had come back to him the way words come back to players who say things, and then must watch the game determine whether what they said was prophecy or invitation. He answered with the candor of a man who had said a thing and watched it invert itself publicly, and who was not inclined to pretend otherwise. "I was just kidding when I said that," Barkley said. Then he paused in the way that Barkley paused before adding the clause that contained the actual content. "But I don't want him to score a lot of points and embarrass us." The embarrassment was the honest word. 47 points was not a number that permitted diplomatic framing. It was a number that said something specific about the distance between what had been announced and what had occurred, between the physics that had been threatened and the physics that had been applied. Barkley, who had the capacity for directness that made him both infuriating and refreshing depending on who was receiving it, understood the math completely. Jordan was asked about Barkley's pregame statement. He had been scoring 47 points in games where no one had made pregame statements. He would score 47 in games where no statement had been made, and 47 more when statements had been made, and the connection between the external event and the internal score was not simple causation but something more like catalysis. The way certain substances accelerate processes that were already in motion, rather than initiating processes that would not otherwise have occurred. Jordan answered with the precision of a man who had thought about this at length and arrived at a formulation he found accurate. "I'd advise him to worry about the game," Jordan said. "The only thing he can do is speak for himself. Whatever he says doesn't matter. I'll just put it out of my mind. He doesn't set the tone for my motivation. I won't let him do that. I won't let him rattle me." The interesting thing about this statement is that Jordan was telling a specific kind of truth that contained a different kind of truth beneath it. He would not let Barkley rattle him. This was accurate. He did not rattle. What happened instead was the transformation of external input into internal resource, the conversion of noise into signal, of threat into coordinate, of "I will break him into little pieces" into a destination Jordan arrived at in the fourth quarter, when he elevated above 252 pounds and made the dunk, arriving at the coordinate that had been set before the game even started. Barkley would finish the 1986-87 season averaging 23 points per game and leading the league in rebounding at 14.6. He would go to the All-Star game for the first time. He would earn All-NBA second team. He was 23 years old and becoming what he would become, which was one of the most dominant and complete power forwards in the history of the sport. One of only 4 players at that time who had compiled 20,000 points, 10,000 rebounds, and 4,000 assists across a career. A player the Hall of Fame would eventually describe as the pound-for-pound and inch-for-inch answer to the question of how much excellence could be compressed into a body that everyone else thought was the wrong shape for the task it was assigned. Jordan would finish the 1986-87 season at 37.1 points per game, becoming only the second player since Wilt Chamberlain to score 3,000 points in a single season, setting Bulls franchise records for points, field goals, free throws, and steals in a single year. He would score 40 or more in 9 consecutive games at one point and score 23 consecutive points in a single game to set an NBA record. He would not win the championship that year. He would not win it the year after, or the year after that, or the year after that. 4 more seasons of accumulating scoring titles and individual awards, while the question about whether scoring titles and individual awards were sufficient to win what championships required followed him through those seasons like weather. He and Barkley would play each other 55 times across their careers. Jordan's record in those games was 31 wins and 24 losses, 12-4 in the playoffs. The 1993 NBA Finals would be their only meeting on the championship stage, the only occasion in which the question of who was better was asked in a context large enough to produce a definitive answer. Barkley had gotten there the right way. He had been traded to Phoenix before the 1992 season, leaving Philadelphia after 8 years of first-round exits and second-round exits, and 1 year in which the Sixers had not made the playoffs at all, leaving for a team with Kevin Johnson and Dan Majorel, and a coach in Paul Westphal, who understood how to build a system around a player of Barkley's specific capabilities. The Suns went 62-20 that season, the best record in the league, and Barkley won the Most Valuable Player award, leading Phoenix in scoring at 25.6 per game and in rebounding at 12.2, the first Phoenix player to win the MVP in franchise history, validation at the highest available level that everything he had done in Philadelphia had been measuring up against a team limitation rather than a personal one. He had made the finals. He was exactly where he had been telling the world he deserved to be for 9 professional seasons. Jordan averaged 41 points per game across those 6 games, a finals record that has not been approached since. Barkley averaged 27.3 points and 13.6 rebounds, extraordinary numbers that in any other context would have defined the series and shaped the championship narrative around the man producing them. In this context, they were the numbers of a player who gave everything he had and lost to a man who gave more. In Game 2, Jordan and Barkley each scored 42 points, the second time in finals history that opposing players had each reached 40 in the same game, a scoring duel that the building in Phoenix received as the thing it was, which was 2 of the greatest players of their generation attempting to outperform each other in the most important competition their sport offered. In Game 4, Jordan scored 55 points, the 5th player in finals history to reach 50, and Barkley said afterward that the biggest difference in the game was that they had Michael Jordan and the Suns did not, which was a sentence that contained everything Barkley knew after 9 professional seasons and 6 games with the championship on the line about the distance between excellent and irreplaceable. Jordan won. Barkley never did. After the January 17th game, as the Chicago Stadium crowd dispersed into the 9-degree night, Barkley sat in the visitors' locker room with the particular quiet of a player who has been in that situation long enough to know what the quiet means. He had brought his body and his will and the full commitment of a man who was 23 years old and had never backed away from a contest in his life, and Jordan had scored 47. There were no partial credits in the structure of this accounting. There was only what had been said and what had happened, and the distance between them was the distance between the world where announcements controlled outcomes and the world where outcomes were determined by something that operated at a different frequency, something that did not process external announcements as information relevant to its operation. The things you say before a game belong to the world of speech. The things that happen in the game belong to a different world entirely. The 2 worlds intersect only at the point where a competitor discovers, on the floor, in real time, that the announcement and the reality are not the same, and that the announcement has been gathered up and converted into something that will be used against the very person who made it. Jordan had used it. He had said he wouldn't let Barkley set his motivation. He was telling the truth about the mechanism while being precise about the result. Barkley had not rattled him. What Barkley had done was hand him the coordinates of a destination Jordan had already been heading toward. He would go back to that place many times in the years that followed. The next opponent who announced something before the game would discover what Barkley had discovered, which is that certain players do not experience pre-game statements as threats, but as invitations, and that the player who extends the invitation is not always certain what they are inviting. Jordan collected the invitations. He filed them in the place where fuel was stored. He played 47 more points of basketball. And in the fourth quarter, above 252 pounds of the best power forward of his generation, he completed the dunk that the pre-game statement had made inevitable from the moment the words were spoken, the destination the words themselves had set, with the clean, unhurried finality of a man who had known all along exactly where he was going.